Next, I'd like to invite up Captain Joseph R. Hibbeln. He's the acting chief for NIH, NIAAA, and he will discuss seafood consumption and neurocognitive development.
Well, good morning. Thank you very much, Linda. As I was saying last night, my grandmother always said that there's a big difference between promise and do. And I feel often that science creates the promise of public health, and unless you do something about it and get it out of the world, it really doesn't matter. And so I really applaud Linda and the Seafood Nutrition Partnership in taking the science and effectively translating it to get more molecules into people's mouths. And it's no small thing. And I'm very delighted to be here. I'm going to speak on seafood in neurocognitive development, and I'll present the results of 2 systematic reviews in the half hour that I have. I'm the acting chief section of nutritional neurosciences at IEEE, and I have no conflicts of interest to report, and I would like to make it unequivocally and absolutely clear that this presentation is my own scientific thoughts and my vision, and that this is not the policy or position of any U.S. federal government, and not the policy or position especially of the NIH. I just want to make that unequivocally clear. This is a visual representation of the topic at hand, and that is to assess a whole fish. So here's a tuna, and in the cartoon there's positive effects of omega-3 fatty acids over here around the head, but there are also other multiple components of the tuna, source of multiple vitamins and minerals, a low-calorie source of protein, a low-sodium, heart-healthy food, and potential hypothetical mercury risk. I think proportionately this area is too large. But we have numbers to assess this question. So the impact, the assessment of the Dietary Guidelines Committee's questions is the consumption of this as a whole food, not as one of its isolated components. So indeed, seafood is a package of brain nutrients. Many think that human brain evolved because seafood was readily available. And it really sort of makes sense when you look at the total complement. For example, the iodine in seafood was lacking in the Midwest during the early 20th century, and because there was no sea source. And resumption of iodine, one of the critical components from fish, resumption of iodine in the salt in 1924 increased the IQ in the upper Midwest an average of 16 points. So that is just one of the components bioactive in seafood. And it's clear that women are more likely to meet their enhanced requirements during pregnancy when they're consuming seafood. So Tom described to you briefly this transparent and well-described process of asking questions and doing an unbiased and comprehensive systematic review of the literature. You develop questions. Now here, this was done by the USDA for the 2020-2025 guidelines, develop analytical frameworks. Now we've done all this step by step, very carefully and very transparently by many members in this room. And I don't have enough time to go in detail for each of these components. Critically, as prescribed by the Dietary Guidelines Committee, the systematic reviews are best done by a technical expert committee that has experience in the field. So this is our technical expert committee. Myself, Phil Spiller, Tom Brenna, Gene Golding, Bruce Holub, Bill Harris, Penny Chris Etherton, Bill Land, Sonia Connor, Gary Myers, Sean Strain, Michael Crawford, and Susan Carlson. These are all well-recognized experts in the field, and none have any conflicts of interest. Again, it's very important to critically focus on the questions and how they are worded. Question number 40 is, what is the relationship between seafood consumption during pregnancy and lactation on neurocognitive development of the infant? So that's not the question of what's the relationship between omega-3 or iodine or mercury on neurocognitive development of the infant. And this is not what's the impact of seafood on growth and development of the infant, just its body size. The specific question is, what's the relationship between seafood and the functional parts of the brain and how it develops? And secondly, what's the relationship between seafood consumption consumed during childhood and adolescence, up to 18 years of age, on the neurocognitive development of the child? So we address these two questions because they described and defined those questions, and we felt as a technical expert committee we could engage in this work because they provided us all the boxes to tick through. So let's look carefully at the definitions of the words. The committee uses seafood as opposed to any single nutrient or chemical component within the seafood, whether naturally occurring or environmental contaminant. Development of the guidance regarding the consumption of seafood is guidance of consumption of seafood as a whole food. That is, whether to eat seafood during pregnancy and feed seafood to children to benefit their neurocognition, rather than modeling the harms or the benefits from the individual components, which is a very different approach to the question than a net effects analysis, which statistically models the mercury and models the benefits. This is using seafood as the independent variable because you're going to wind up they're going to wind up giving advice about seafood. So according to the 2010 definition, seafood is a large category of marine animals that live in the sea and live in freshwater lakes and rivers. So muskellunge in the UP is seafood, and perch is seafood. Includes fish, salmon, oysters, trout. Now, marine mammals, porpoises and whales, including pilot whales, which are not commonly consumed by Americans, and sea plants are not considered to be seafood in this definition. So we went through a lot of data, and in this process it's hard to read, but what we did first was to use systematic review searches of PubMed, Embase, and the Cochrane databases, and identified 2,124 articles that could potentially be relevant to this question, and hand looked through them and excluded the duplicates and those that were from clinicaltrials.gov to come up with 1,130 non-duplicate references. I and other members of the Technical Advisory Committee looked at every title and every abstract and excluded 993 of them. Wound up with 137 not excluded by the title of the abstract, and identified another 8 by hand searches to get 145 references critically examined for all the inclusion and exclusion criteria, excluded 115 of them, and found 44 references that met inclusion criteria. Some of the references had data on both pregnancy and childhood. In pregnancy, we found 29 observational trials and 9 case control trials, and this evaluated more than 100,000 mother-infant pairs. So that's a good sample size, and evaluated the worldwide most extreme levels of seafood consumption. And in the child, 6 RCTs, 4 prospective cohort trials, 9 case control. And there are some kind of case control trials, like nested case control, that at the time we started the systematic review, the Nesser committee defined as admissible for systematic review. This is an example of our table, and there's 29 different studies for maternal seafood consumption in pregnancy. We have the author, the year. Here is a study of 38,581 mother-infant pairs. We use the risk of assessment bias tool. We list the outcomes here: speech and language, a surrogate of verbal IQ, list beneficial associations, list the amount of seafood consumed, and standardized it for all studies to ounces per week. And when a study provided mercury exposure data, we collected that and then standardized or converted to hair parts per million in mercury. And this is one of 3 studies that reported that increased mercury exposure, that is blood levels, were associated with benefits. Here, the speech and language scores, and when the mothers had intakes of seafood less than 14 ounces per week. This is one of 3 studies that reported that higher levels of mercury was associated with better neurocognition, which is unlikely to be due directly to the mercury. It's likely to be due to the overwhelming benefits of the seafood and mercury just tagging along as a biomarker of dietary intake. So that's in 38,000 mother-infant pairs, and some comments here. So we do that for all of the studies. So the distillation of the results are as follows from this effort, and that is, among these 29 reports and 102,994 mother-infant pairs, we could find no published report of harm to children when mothers ate fish, all the way at the highest levels of seafood intake. When you're looking at the independent variable as seafood consumption, there is no published data of harm from seafood consumption at any level of intake. In 24 of 29 studies, they reported that the seafood consumption among the mothers was associated with benefit. 5 studies reported no significant associations or null, and again, none reported harm. The size of the benefits was quite clinically meaningful. In the 5 studies that reported IQ directly as IQ, they ranged from 5.6 points of benefit to 9.5 points of benefit, with an average benefit of 7.7 full IQ points. Now, in comparison, the estimated IQ gain from breastfeeding is about 3 IQ points, if that data is true and not confounded. So it's quite a significant bump. And this is as seafood as a whole food, including the mercury in the seafood. The beneficial outcomes appeared on the tests as early as 3 days of age and as late as 17 years of age, with nearly all the testing occurring through age 9. The benefits began at the lowest amounts of seafood consumption, which was about a meal a week, and we standardized meals to 4 ounces a week, unless otherwise cited in the tests, and continued all the way up past 12 ounces per week, which is the upper limit of intake for pregnancy, and all the way past 100 ounces per week. In some studies, oily fish, tuna, salmon, swordfish, showed benefits when whitefish and shellfish did not. However, that's in the existing data set out there. That's as detailed as you can get on species, is a categorization of oily and white. There is no specific data on orange roughy or sardines or any specific fish. There is no direct data published on those. However, data are insufficient from all studies for a conclusive statement regarding types of seafood, either oily or white, or specific species that might convey greatest benefits. Those were the conclusions. We used the rubric of the USDA to grade the evidence. Strong is free from design, mostly randomized placebo-controlled trials. If the data is predominantly prospective cohort data, sometimes it can be strong. If it's as good as a randomized trial, but largely because it's prospective cohort data, it becomes moderate. Our technical expert committee reviewed this, and we detailed out our rationale and found that moderate and consistent evidence indicates that consumption of wide ranges and amounts of commercially available seafood during pregnancy is associated with improved neurocognitive development of the offspring as compared to eating no seafood. The evidence does not meet criteria for strong only due to the absence of randomized controlled trials, which may not be ethical or feasible to conduct in pregnancy. What do you do for a placebo fish in pregnancy? And because we have dietary advice for women to eat fish in pregnancy, how could you assign someone to a group of not eating fish in pregnancy? Right. So the results of seafood consumption in childhood, there were 15 manuscripts describing 16,444, I think, children themselves. 13 of 15 manuscripts reported beneficial neurocognitive outcomes. 2 reported findings that were null, and none reported any adverse outcomes. Beneficial relationships to intelligence were reported in 2 largest prospective trials, and in a smaller prospective trial among aged kids, verbal IQ gained 4.75 IQ points and full-scale 4.8 IQ points when fish consumption was greater than 4 ounces a week compared to less seafood. And in 4 studies, greater seafood consumption among the kids was associated with substantially lower risks for a diagnosis of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder using diagnostic and statistical manual criteria. The technical advisory committee could find no amount of seafood that resulted in net adverse outcomes for neurocognitive development in children. The upper ranges of consumption were not as well described as in the pregnancy studies. Seafood provided overall benefits, neurocognitive development, and exceeded potential harms from mercury. However, in the children, no studies reported specifically what their exposure was to mercury. We have to assume that greater seafood consumption, since almost all seafood contains mercury, that there was a greater exposure to mercury in the children, as there was a greater exposure to mercury in the moms. Data were insufficient for a conclusive statement regarding neurocognitive effects from seafood types or species, and it was conducted in healthy children. So the conclusion statement is moderate and consistent evidence indicates that consumption of greater than 4 ounces per week and likely greater than 12 ounces per week of a wide range of commercially available seafood during childhood and adolescence has beneficial associations to a wide spectrum of neurocognitive outcomes as compared to eating no seafood. The evidence does not meet criteria for strong because of an insufficient number of randomized controlled trials. I want to now address the difference of approaching this question concerning whether you look at seafood as we have done and defined by the dietary guidelines as a whole food with brain nutrients and at the same time potentially adverse components versus consideration and development of advice using mercury alone as one sole isolated component of seafood. So in our study, again, we standardized all the exposures, converted them to maternal hair mercury. This is one of the 3 studies we found. This had 8,800 mother-infant pairs. The other study, Vedrup, had 38,000 mother-infant pairs. And a third study from Barbone was a collective study from 5 different, and each of these 3 studies reported a positive association between higher levels of prenatal mercury exposure and greater gains in IQ. Here, in the Alsbach study, we split the cohort into mothers that ate fish and clearly got greater mercury exposure from eating fish, and mothers who did not eat fish. So this is a continuous improvement by higher levels of mercury. And also please note that there are many other sources that describe the variability of mercury among mothers because these mean levels are not that different. Fish is not the only thing that predicts the level of mercury in your blood. Again, to reorient you to using mercury as an isolated component in evaluating fish, these are the data that were used to derive the reference dose. So here is a log scale of cord mercury in the moms and test scores on the Boston naming test adjusted for controllers out there. And this was done in 2000 by the National Research Council. And here first they found a level at which mercury had a 0.05 significance of harm and found out what was the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval and described that as the BMDL. And very conservatively, because the uncertainty as to what is a safety level or not, a safety factor of 10-fold safety factor was added, which is common in toxicology. And the reference dose comes here to 5.8 micrograms per liter here. So this is not a level of, defined as a level of threshold where harm definitely occurs. It's described as a level thought to be safe. So based solely on mercury as an isolated component, the EPA and FDA issued this advice in 2017, and advice for eating fish, what pregnant women should know. Fish and other protein-rich foods have nutrients that help your child's growth and development. Now, I looked through the data, and I didn't see any studies cited referring to impact on growth and development. And I found it curious that seafood was only described as a protein-rich food, and what's missing here is neurocognitive development as an outcome. So there's best choices, eat 2 to 3 servings a week. Good choices, eat only 1 serving a week, and choices to avoid with the highest mercury levels. So here are the data from the EPA about these fish, and you can see this line distinguishes avoid from good and good from best. And it's curious that the definition is not by the predicted reference dose, which was the level of safety. This distinguishing of good from bad to avoid is at 0.45 of the reference dose. And I couldn't find in the data how 0.45 was selected or calculated. If the reference dose is what's known to be safe, how was it selected to be 0.45? Now, it just happens that conveniently describes the fish to avoid, as was described in the 2004 document. There may be, I just couldn't find written rationale as to why that level was chosen. But it is, it's safe. If you're looking at mercury as an isolated component, very, very reasonable thing to do to be safe. So I do, with regards to anything that's high, medium, or low, I think it's really important to understand relative perspective. High, medium, low, as compared to what? So here, this woman is high, that fellow is medium, and that fellow is low. Now, that's high. And I think this is roughly a visual representation to what high, medium, and low levels of mercury are in relationship to one another, in comparison to at least a tenfold uncertainty factor of where you know there's danger or harm. So when people speak of high mercury fish, it's high in relationship to medium or in relationship to low. So what does it mean in terms of impact to IQ? So I used the EPA's data that they published on the advisory, and the average fish to avoid if you eat one meal a week, which you shouldn't do, you're eating too much. This is the expected maternal hair mercury, and using the EPA's paper by Axelrod, this change in mercury could be expected to result in the IQ loss of a child of 0.11 IQ points. So the relative importance of high in comparison to good, if you ate 2 meals a week, which is one too many, the child might lose 0.06 IQ points, and best 0.02 IQ points. That's theoretically modeled because it is impossible in human clinical and epidemiological studies to actually measure fractions of IQ points in human beings, and it's not thought to be clinically meaningful. So here's a graphical representation of the loss of IQ between good, eating these levels at avoid, good, and best, and in comparison to our findings when seafood consumption is considered as a whole food, that is, the nutrients plus the mercury. There's a 7.7 IQ gain. So part 3 of our conclusions, in 23 of our 29 studies, mercury exposures exceeded the EPA reference dose in the cohorts, and often by many times. And despite this, consuming seafood with pregnancy was likely beneficial and was clearly not adverse to neurocognition because there was no harm, even though the consumption exceeded the reference dose. And we could find no data regarding neurocognitive effects of development from consuming specific species distinguished by levels of mercury in the studies by any quantitative definition of high, moderate, or low mercury. We don't have any direct data to address that question. It's an issue of modeling mercury as an isolated component, which is, one way to do it. And there's insufficient data on conclusions from freshwater and wild-caught species. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Rice and herb. When we looked at the Alsbach study and we assessed neutrally from the food frequency questionnaires what were the foods that described the variance in mercury levels. First of all food only described 14% of the variance in mercury levels, and seafood described only about 7% of the variance in mercury levels. So when you look at a blood level of mercury, it's determined by many things. Absorption, excretion, different combinations of foods. Seafood is not the sole determinant of mercury, especially in rice coming from China, from downwind of coal-fired power plants has more mercury. Again, but relatively more, higher, lower, doesn't mean dangerous.
That was a great synopsis of the EPA FDA chart.
Here's a microphone.
Is it on? Yes. Hi, Rebecca McIsaac from Department of Health and Human Services. I was curious if you will be publishing the systematic reviews that you described, and if so, when and where?
Yes, ma'am. We're ready for publication, and we'll take it under advisement from the editor, and we'll feed this into the big stream of knowledge that's going into the Dietary Guidelines Committee, and if they think it's useful, that's great.
Hi. So my understanding, if I understand it right, is that what the EPA is looking at, and by extension the FDA, is they're looking at risk, as in the risk to humans of the contaminant when they're looking at the pregnancy, the women in pregnancy chart that you showed before. But what you're talking about here is a greater risk, basically a risk of I would almost say impairment. Or certainly of curtailed potentiality in terms of our youth. How do we flip the expectation, or how do we flip this expectation in terms of put the pressure in the other direction in terms of driving the potential, driving towards potential rather than trying to squeeze out that small amount of potential risk here?
Well, I really, I don't want to be in the position of describing what the EPA does and whether it's a risk assessment or not, but their charge and mandate, and they do a very good job of trying to keep us safe from toxicants and pollutants, and that's their mandate, and they do a darn good job of it. So their mandate is not to look at nutritional benefits. I think that the way I look at these data, if I were to describe it to the public, is there's a lost opportunity for IQ when mothers are not eating fish. And from the data using seafood consumption as the variable, which is what is advised to women, in more than 100,000 mother-infant pairs, we cannot find any evidence of harm up to the highest levels of seafood consumption in pregnancy. And typically women eat a variety of seafood in pregnancy. Very few people would eat, 1 or 2 meals of shark every week throughout all of pregnancy, or swordfish. Yes, sir.
Question, when you were showing question regarding your slide showing when you were looking at different parts of data, different data sources, and what your exclusion, some of the exclusion criteria.
Oh, right. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things listed was if it were listed on clinicaltrials.gov. And that seems strange to me. Is that even if it was published?
So when you do the screenings in the databases and you put in all of your search words, which we have in our supplement, sometimes you'll get references to the description of studies to be done that are posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So that reference doesn't count as a study with results. It's a descriptor.
Yeah, can you just comment on what you hope the committee does with this report?
I hope that they read it carefully. And it's
will they welcome it? I mean, this was unsolicited.
I
right?
can't speak for them. Their history in the past is that they have absolutely welcomed and embraced assessments from technical experts in the fields of expertise. That's what they've traditionally done, and they've just moved to try to do more of the systematic reviews in-house, so as to establish consistency and transparency and reproducibility. So we went, I went to the head chair of the Nesser process and let her know we were going to do this. And when we had questions about how they were doing their Nesser, she addressed those questions to me and helped me clarify what were the correct processes. What they do with it is their business. They can ignore it completely if they like. They can embrace it. That's not my job.
So about a year and a half ago, the American Heart Association, in their journal Circulation, published an article that reviewed the literature on bleeding and its risk to benefit ratio with individuals, and should they be taking fish oil, eating enough seafood, and the risk benefit ratio around surgery and other cardiovascular conditions. And they determined that the benefit far outweighed the risk to consume fish and take fish oil in lieu of other conditions. And their outcome was that individuals should talk to their healthcare practitioners and weigh the options and have a thoughtful discussion. So how, in this case, can we take this public health information and align with some national organization or something that we can really help disseminate this message for new moms and babies in the future?
Well, to address your first question, I hope that this work doesn't cause any bleeding. And as an officer in my current position, that's not my role and that's not my position to translate these data and these findings to public health messages. Those public health messages are regulated and considered by a transparent process of the United States government. This data is part of informing them of that process and having them make that decision.
Any other questions? Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hibbeln. And I know that process of the systematic review has taken since March, and so it has been a huge undertaking. And to boil it down to a few slides doesn't allow you to understand the magnitude of work that has gone into it. So thank you so much.